let me thank you guys for all coming to our Autism Symposium. We're really happy to have you here. I am Heather Hoffman. I'm a psychologist in the community, and I am also a board member at Mental Health Awareness of Michiana. So our goal at NPM, as we call ourselves, is to raise awareness in the community about mental health in general so that we can help reduce stigma. We're also attempting to provide a lot more educational events like this one that are geared towards providers and family members and just the community in general. And so we've been around since about 2018, and now that COVID is slowly starting to give us a little relief, we are ramping back up our efforts to have more and more of these types of symposiums. So thank you for joining us for this. And I especially also want to thank Lighthouse Autism Center and Meridian Health Services for being sponsors of this event. All right, so now I have to tell you guys about Dr. Joshua Diehl. I'm so excited to have him here with us. So Dr. Diehl is the Chief Program Officer for Child and Adolescent Services at Logan, and he also holds a role as a faculty fellow at St. Mary's in their Masters of Autism Studies program. He has been recognized regionally and nationally for his teaching, for his research, and for his clinical work. He's been featured in lots of major academic journals. He's written book chapters. He's earned prestigious grants. He's been in some of the mainstream journals like the Wall Street Journal, WebMD. He's been featured on major media outlets, NBC, MSNBC, PBS. We really do have an expert here in our field to talk to you guys today. And, you know, he attributes his inspiration for his work to his little brother, who was born with a developmental disability. And so he really does have a lot of things to offer us. So with that said, I'm just happy to have him here, and thank you guys for coming.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully I can bring you a little bit of energy here early in the morning. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and talk about something I'm really passionate about in this community. Now, you mentioned that I was a SIB. Are there any parents or stakeholders here today? One other thing that I wanted to mention, my brother has been my inspiration, but also my mother and father have also been my inspiration. I'm one of those weirdos that if you look up here, I always put my middle name in my title. Most people don't call me that, but that's because my father's name is John Diehl, and he advocated for my brother to be one of the first to be an inclusive environment actually the first in our county to be in an inclusive environment. So really proud of what he's done, and I just have so much respect for all of the parents that are, you know, working so hard for the best of their loved ones. So so today this is kind of a broad look at autism. We have, from what I can tell, a really diverse group of people who are with us. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to touch on some major issues and how they connect to resources in our community. But I just wanted to let all of you know that with my role at Logan, part of what I do is speak to organizations and support organizations at no charge. That's why an organization like Logan exists, to serve this community. So if there's ever any of these topics that you ever think it would be useful for me to come to your organization or your staff and talk to them and go into deep dives about things that might be relevant to you, I'm happy to do that. That's what I'm here for. And being from Logan, you know, we don't charge anything. We have so much support from our community that it allows me to reach out to you and work with you. And even if it's just a phone call, you can always call me and we can talk things through. So really excited to see all of you today. Heather gave you a little bit of my background. I wanted to go a little bit more in depth. I'm kind of a weirdo in that I started out thinking I was going to be a researcher. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but I really thought I was going to do research. And in particular, I was interested in interventions and also social communication in individuals with autism and their family. I was at Notre Dame, and a lot of families were coming to us for research, and we're saying, man, you know, we don't have this in the community, or we don't have that in the community, we really need this. And over time, even though I had one of the coolest jobs in the world, I thought, it really kind of weighed on me that there was the possibility that I could do more for my community. So I made the switch from Notre Dame to Logan to try to help increase the amount of services that we have in our community. And when I came to Notre Dame at the time, there really wasn't very much. And even when I switched over to Logan, I think the only two ABA providers, for example, at the time were Logan and Lighthouse. And now that aspect of services has really grown in our community. But that being said, you'll see as we go through different areas and we talk about different areas, there are some things as a community and really as a culture that we're doing much better at, and some other things that are just major gaps that I'm hoping that we as a community can kind of work together on improving. That's why I love this kind of gathering, and I love an organization like this organization to be able to help bring awareness to the community. I couldn't get rid of that teaching bug, so I do still teach at St. Mary's in the Master of Autism Studies program. It's an awesome professional training program that's made to train leaders in the autism field, regardless of what your background is. So if any of you are interested in talking about that, I'd be happy to give you more information on what we're doing, whether you're interested or you might have some people with whom you work that might be interested in this additional training right here in our community. So I'm gonna go through a couple of topics, and again, all of these topics are really big topics. So I'm gonna hit on what I think are some key points in these different areas. But again, these are things that each one of these could be their own discussion, it could be their own presentation. So we'll spend more or less time on each of these depending on what your interests are and what your questions are. So we're gonna start about just making sure we're all on the same page about what autism is and what autism isn't, and also talk about some misconceptions that I believe are pretty prevalent misconceptions about autism. We're going to dive a little bit into how identification and diagnosis works, and some things to look for. I know we have a lot of providers in the community, so we're going to talk about some things to look for that might lead you to make referrals related to autism. And try to connect you with a couple of different kind of broader resources that you might not know about. We're going to talk about the treatment that's available in our community. There's, like I said, there's some things that we're really good at, and there's some things that as a community we need more of. And I'll also try to identify those gaps in treatment and resources and support within our community. And then at the end, given the nature of this organization, I wanted to touch a bit about autism and mental health, which I think is one of the most underlooked issues and really a moral imperative for all of us to try to figure out. So that's what we're going to be working through today. So part of this has been a campaign, and I've known Leanne forever, since I first came here, and she knows that I always put up this slide. And the idea that one of the greatest public health campaigns of my generation has been the Autism Awareness campaign. It was all over the place. I mean, you see it in the news, you heard it on the radio. It was tremendously successful. But it created an issue in that there was a lot of awareness of autism, but not a lot of knowledge about what autism is and what autism isn't. And what that led to is a lot of misinformation, where parents and providers were given, often misleading information about autism. And I think, honestly, it created a lot of fear and a lot of unnecessary stigma for individuals with autism and their families. So that's part of why these sorts of things are really important, so we can kind of change that. And again, that gets with the theme of kind of reducing this stigma that we have about mental health. Now, even talking about autism within the context of mental health has been a controversial thing. Autism really kind of got caught between the systems. For a while, especially in the really early 2000s, autism was kind of caught, but families were caught between the medical system and the academic system, because it wasn't really clear what autism was. Is this a mental health condition, or is this some sort of developmental disability condition? Diagnostically, it's included in the mental health diagnostic code, but it's also included now in the school, the diagnoses that you can get in school. So we've worked towards, the fact that it's kind of both, but the fact that it had origins, it was originally thought of and called childhood schizophrenia, I think kind of tied it to mental health for a while. But since a lot of the people that were receiving supports needed those supports in the school, it was also an incredibly important issue for academics and for school. But for a while, a lot of families were caught in between these two systems. So we came up with this term for these group of diagnoses, like autism and ADHD and learning disabilities, this idea that they're neurodevelopmental disorders. And this is, again, kind of a category that's in between developmental disability and mental health. And so autism, like something like ADHD, is defined, diagnosed, and treated based on behaviors that you see. And so that's different from Down syndrome, where if you have 3 copies of chromosome 21, then you have Down syndrome. If you don't have those, then you don't have Down syndrome. There's a medically identifiable cause, and it's defined by an etiology, whereas autism is kind of is defined based on behavior. So there are some people who meet all of the criteria, some people who meet some of the criteria, and then there's a lot of us in the community that have what we call the broader autism phenotype, where you have characteristics of autism. And autism is really amazing because it's kind of a different way of processing the world, which can lead to strengths, relative strengths, in terms of processing the world in areas of disability and areas in need of support. So thinking about it in that way as a different way of processing the world, and thinking about it as being defined based on behaviors, kind of gives you an idea of why autism is considered a spectrum. Now, our field hasn't done a very good job of giving us clarity in understanding autism. We've changed our diagnostic criteria 5 times over the past 40 years, and we kept making them broader and broader and broader. And then we threw all these terms like Asperger's disorder and PDD and all these things that I think, because we really didn't quite know the scope of autism, kind of contributed to this confusion. Essentially, with our diagnostic criteria in 2013, and now that it's been revised in 2022, we're kind of putting all of these under this Autism Spectrum Disorder criteria. Now, it hasn't changed in some of the other diagnostic manuals, so you might still hear PDD, NOS, you might still hear Asperger's syndrome or Asperger's disorder, but ultimately right now, with our best knowledge, we're thinking about all of these as part of the spectrum. So when you hear all these other diagnoses, we think of these as part of the autism spectrum. Now, I don't want to go too in depth into the diagnostic criteria, but there's a couple of things that I want to highlight related to the diagnostic criteria. Ultimately, everything we think about with autism relates back to social difficulties. And even when we talk about repetitive behaviors, and when we talk about sensory issues, why these become important within the constellation of what we talk about in autism is how they affect an individual's ability to socialize and to navigate their community. So ultimately, the crux of what we talk about with all of this other noise, autism, the crux of it is difficulties with social interaction and communication. And so it could be so significant that an individual is not able to communicate or has very limited verbal communication. They might need to use a communication device. Or it could be that an individual is actually very, very social and very, very verbal, but really has trouble developing and maintaining social relationships, initiating conversations, keeping those conversations going, knowing when to stop those conversations appropriately. The idea of social and emotional reciprocity is this idea that kind of goes across a spectrum. The idea that in social communication, when we communicate with other people, that it's an exchange of information, that it's not me standing up and lecturing to you about how my day was, even though we all do that to a certain extent. But the idea that social interaction is a connection between people. And often that piece in social communication, it's what's hard for individuals with autism. And whether that individual is nonverbal and they have barriers to making those connections, or they're verbal and they kind of don't understand the rules of how to make those connections. Fundamentally, that's what we're talking about with autism. Now, for the longest time, we thought you had to have language difficulties to meet criteria of autism. Our earliest diagnostic criteria, that was a criterion. But now we know that language varies in the population of individuals with autism. Like I said, some people are very verbal, some people are not verbal. But it's that communication piece that's really the important piece. Now, I want to highlight one misconception, and this is probably, I think, the biggest misconception about autism, is that individuals with autism do not want to be social. That it is a deficit of social motivation. And it's so incorrect. It's so incorrect. I've met so many individuals with autism in my life, and they vary in their desire to be social, just like all of us do. All of us in this room. Some of us are really, really social, want to be around people all the time, want to connect with people. Whereas other of us would prefer just to be at home reading a book. And both of those things are okay, because that's what your social desire is. And in individuals with autism, it varies the exact same way. I've met kids that want to make friends so badly that they'll get so excited at their opportunities, they'll get up in their friend's face and they'll be doing everything that they can to engage with them, but they don't necessarily know how to do it appropriately in a way that's going to help them make friends. And I've known other individuals that are totally fine just kind of being on their own. So that's something that's really, really key, and something that's been a really big misconception about autism is how much they vary, just like we vary in terms of their desire to be able to connect with other people. And how this overlaps with mental health, and this is the thing that's hard for us providers and for us as a community. There might be some individuals that do want to connect with other people, but they've had so many social failures that they get anxious and they withdraw because they've had so many bad experiences. So that's a piece that's not as simple as somebody not interacting with other people and maybe not wanting to interact with other people. It could be because of their repeated social failures over time. So it's complex, it's not easy, and that's why we all need to work together as families and as providers to be able to help these individuals get to their desired quality of life. Now, when we talk about repetitive behaviors, even things like lining things up and putting things in order and sensory issues, needs for routine, all of these things are a part of autism and are important to understand about autism because of how they affect somebody's individual ability to connect with other people. One of the things that verbal individuals with autism have is some verbal individuals with autism have really, really intense interest or specific interests in a topic. Now, we all have things that we're really interested in. I love fantasy football, and I could talk about fantasy football forever. I just love it. So we all have those interests. But for individuals with autism, the issues that they have often intersect on this with their social issues, in the sense that when they interact with other people, they might really want to connect over this interest that they have, but they have trouble making connections with other people because of their ability to recognize that, hey, maybe not everybody has this interest, or maybe not everybody wants to talk about this specific interest. One of my favorite kids, and this was way back in the day, when I was on my clinical internship, he came into his very first therapy session with me, and he comes up and he goes, "Hello, my name is so-and-so, and I know everything about birds." And you know what? He knew everything about birds. He was carrying a book of birds. And that's great that he had this really specific interest. That's not a disability. None of that. But over the course of our first session, every time that we started to try to talk about other things, he would skillfully take the conversation back to having a conversation how this related about birds. He even renamed his home Bird HQ, Bird Headquarters. It actually said it on his house. So, but the issue for him was that this often interfered with his ability to connect with other people and make friends. And that's what he wanted to do. He had that desire. For the kids that are engaging in repetitive play, oftentimes they're playing next to somebody and not necessarily playing with somebody. So that's the key piece related to things like repetitive play, is how that interferes with your ability to connect with other people. Now, sensory issues, sensory differences are things that we're just kind of trying to get to know. We know that individuals with autism have sensory differences, and a certain percentage, not all of them, but we also know that people in the community who don't have autism have sensory processing differences. So we're really trying to understand how that relates to autism. But we know that some individuals are hypersensitive to sensory information. It could almost sound or touch, things like that could feel like nails on a chalkboard to them. It could be very, very aversive. And so being cognizant of what these issues are and helping them be able to not avoid things, but get used to them and accommodate them is part of being able to be social and be friends and be able to navigate the community. Another issue is that some individuals may be hyposensitive to sensory information. So they might be sensory seeking. They might be craving deep pressure or deep touch. It's something that they're doing. They might be rocking to get their vestibular system going. And it's it's something that we all kind of do. I can see some of you like bouncing your foot and twirling your hair or biting on your pencil. These are all things that we do to get sensory information. Now, we've learned to do them in an appropriate way. And now individuals with autism struggle often with what's socially appropriate and what's not socially appropriate. So again, even these sensory issues tie into this aspect of social interaction that's so important. Now, you'll hear it and you'll see it over and over again. And for me, this is something that often bothers me. That autism is primarily in males, in boys. You see it in representations in media, you see it in statistics everywhere. Even if you go to the CDC today, it's going to say autism is 4 times more common in males than females. But this is really misleading. And it's causing a lot of issues for girls and women on the spectrum. There's a nationwide research project that's going on called the Autism Sisters Project. Because autism is more common in boys. Some of the genes that we see are X-linked, and boys only have 1 X chromosome and girls have 2. So girls seem to have a little bit of genetic difference that makes it less likely that they would be diagnosed with autism. However, because of that, most research studies and our diagnostic criteria are based on males. And as we're learning more about females with autism, that the phenotype, the presenting phenotype might actually be a little bit different and might actually be a little subtle that might not be caught by our diagnostic criteria. It might not be caught by our diagnostic instruments. We're starting to see little things. Females have a tendency to be able to hide, or what's called camouflaging symptoms, our diagnostic criteria of autism. Even though they might still struggle in social interaction, they may be socially skilled enough to be able to hide what's socially appropriate and what's not socially appropriate. It seems like certain things that we would see in autism, in boys with autism, we aren't necessarily going to see as much in girls. The specific interests, for example, aren't as common in boys as they are in girls. We also know that, as I was saying, that the diagnostic instruments might not be tuned into this female phenotype. Now, the issue is that we don't have a great characterization of what this phenotype is yet. We're starting to see trends. We're starting to see that, yeah, girls are more subtle in their symptoms. But there's actually another piece to this, and it goes beyond symptom presentation. Is that there have been studies that have shown that girls with the same presenting symptoms as boys with autism are less likely to get an autism diagnosis, are more likely to get an emotionally related mental health diagnosis. Even with those same presenting symptoms, it takes longer to get the autism diagnosis. And it also it takes longer to get them accepted into treatment. So yes, autism is more common in boys than girls, but we're missing girls. I'm sure those of you who have worked in the field of ADHD or learning disabilities have seen similar trends where girls might present differently and they might not be picked up as much. And we're actually seeing the same things in research with girls with autism. So for those of you who are professionals, don't necessarily rule out autism just because of somebody's gender. It's something that we're really trying to work through. A third misconception related to diagnosis, and this will be a nice transition into diagnosis for us. For the longest time, parents would talk about their children losing skills. And a lot of professionals, researchers, and clinicians kind of poo-pooed them. Kind of said, you know, you just weren't an expert in autism. Those signs of autism were there and you didn't see that. And then parents, which I love parents because especially parents of individuals with autism are so persistent in trying to make the point to get the help that they need. They started doing retrospective videos or showing retrospective videos to researchers and clinicians that showed typical development and then a loss of skills. So there were a series of studies. They were babysit studies tracking children from birth through development who were actually at higher likelihood to be diagnosed with autism because they had an older brother or sister who had autism. And we started to see that regression or a loss of skills was actually quite common. And often for families, it's one of the first things that they see when they seek out services, that there was language that was there, communication that was there that is no longer there. So this is actually a real thing and something to take into account. Now, not every child shows regression. Some individuals will show typical development and then have a plateau of skills. So there are a lot of different developmental patterns within autism. So it's not something that you can expect that there's been some difficulty throughout life. There have been pretty clear instances of individuals who have lost skills. So that gets us kind of to diagnosis, and you can see with this spectrum why all of this is kind of hard. So the diagnosis is based on behavior, and so the diagnosis is imperfect, and it's based on clinical judgment. There's no way around that. A clinician has to be trained in autism and be able to understand who has autism, what are the characteristics, and so forth. We know that the earlier you can get diagnosed, the better. And this has been a big push. Let's get early diagnosis so we get early support. Because if you can get early support, it improves outcomes throughout the lifetime. But that's actually also led to another misconception in that if a child isn't improving by school age or by the age of 11, that, well, we're past the early diagnosis and the early intervention period. So what are we going to do? And I know all of us in this room are not in the early intervention period anymore, right? We're all, 25, 35, 40, that's how old I am, but we're all still learning things, right? We're still all improving. We're all getting better at certain skills. In fact, we can, at this age, we can actually focus on things better. So just because early intervention is important doesn't mean all of these stages don't have value. And at all of these stages, we can't make skill developments and improvements, and sometimes pretty significant improvements. So early intervention is critical, it's important, but not we can't ignore these older ages. I always make the argument that autism is overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. The way we've set up our system for treatments such as ABA is a very widely applicable treatment. And people with or without autism could benefit from aspects of a treatment like ABA. Children of all different diagnoses and children with no diagnoses can benefit from speech therapy because we all are learning speech. We all go through those developmental patterns, but we get treatment based on a diagnosis. So a lot of people are seeking diagnoses of autism, even though they might not fit traditional autism, because of the system we've set up, where you need to be able to have that diagnosis to access the services that you need. And I don't fault parents or anybody for trying to connect people with the services that their child needs in any way that they can. Autism is also underdiagnosed. I think we miss a lot of, you've already heard me talk about girls. I'll talk a little bit about racial and ethnic minorities that are missed, and also separately people who are in lower SES communities often don't have access to the services that we might have in a community like South Bend right now. But broadly speaking, within diagnosis, because it's based on behavior, there's a lack of consistency in how the diagnostic criteria are applied. And it's not just a problem in our community, it's a problem worldwide. So we know that autism can be reliably diagnosed by 18 months. Earlier than that is really hard. Because a lot of things we talk about with social development, there are little cues to social development early on, but babies are all over the place. So it's really hard to be able to see what's typical and what's atypical. But 18 months is a good diagnosis. The problem is that a lot of people aren't able to get that diagnosis or don't get that diagnosis until they're 4 or 5. Now that's getting better, we're getting better, but it's a lot later than we can typically diagnose autism. But even though 18 months is about when we can do in a lot of families, more than half express some sort of concerns pretty early on. So the things that we typically see are language delay, no babbling, those sorts of things, or a regression or a loss of skills. Some parents will say that they're worried about their child's hearing because their child is not orienting toward their voice or responding to their name. Now, what's amazing is how, I talked about how hard it is to diagnose, but what's amazing is how social babies are really early on. It's just the issue is that it's really subtle. Now, when I was originally, I was thinking that there were going to be a certain group of people here. I was originally going to go into early concerns. So I'm not going to, given our group here, I'm not going to do that as much right now. However, I always feel like this is a good time to show a baby video. So we're going to watch a baby video here. This is my son, Jack. He is 12 hours old in this video. And I want to show you a very specific social thing that he's doing, even at 12 hours old. We at birth are tuned to social information. We're almost like social maidens. We seek all of the social information that we can get. And babies will lock onto faces, will lock onto voices. Even in utero, we can, right when we're first born, we can differentiate our mother's voice from other voices, our native language from other languages. It's amazing what babies can do. Now, if you watch Jack here, Jack is kind of chewing on the side of his blanket, and then you'll hear his mom, who's holding him, say something. And hopefully you can see what happens when she says something. Watch his eyes. Did you see his eyes in his head? It was really subtle. As soon as his mom started talking. So not only, what Jack was kind of doing his own thing, as soon as he heard his mom's voice, boom, his eyes and his head locked right on her face. And she opened her mouth and he imitated her at 12 hours old. And things like this are all the building blocks towards social interaction. And there are all these subtle things that we do. There's some studies on individuals with autism that kind of get at this idea of processing the world differently. If you look at these lines, these are tracking infants and toddlers' eyes as they're looking at a scene. And they're watching this video. And the video on the top is a kid playing in the sandbox and a kid who is not diagnosed with autism. And all of his eye contact, all of his gaze is devoted at this cool toy and what this kid's doing and what this kid's looking at. And even at a really early age is like hyper focused in on the kid and what he's doing. This other individual who was later diagnosed with autism, was not diagnosed with autism yet. He looked at what this kid was doing, but he's also looking at things that are going on in the background. So paying attention to everything that's in the scene. So this gets at the idea of how individuals with autism might process the world differently. It's not necessarily a disability in that sense, but a difference in the sense that most of us seem to prioritize this social information, anything that we can pick up from the environment. Whereas individuals with autism will pay attention to it, but they won't devote as much energy and attention to it, and might focus on other things like patterns or things that are different from what their environment is typically. And so that sort of focus can lead to strengths, but you can see how that focus could also lead you to struggle in areas such as social interaction, because social interaction is so hard and it's so hard to learn. For those of you that are interested in learning more about some of the early signs, instead of going into a lot of these things, because I've already talked about these things, I wanted to give you a resource. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Autism Navigator. It's a free resource that's online. You can see the website here, autismnavigator.com, and it's pretty incredible. Essentially, what it's doing is it takes each of the diagnostic criteria and it shows typical expected social behavior right next to things that we might see in individuals with autism and young individuals with autism. It's amazing. And you'll watch one video and the next thing you know, you'll watch 20 videos. But it's such a great tool. I do it with my students, and I hope that some of you might be interested. If you're interested in learning some of the early signs or sharing this with your staff, this resource is really incredible. And you can see right here, it has all of the different diagnostic criteria at different ages and videos of things to look for. So it's an incredible training tool. So I just wanted to show that to you, because we don't really have enough time to be able to go into depth in a lot of these early signs, but that's a great tool for you. Now, going from this early identification to getting an actual diagnosis, the gold standard, the best thing is to get a multidisciplinary evaluation, which includes a diagnostic evaluation, speech, a medical evaluation. Many individuals with autism will also have associated health concerns. So it's always good to kind of have a team working on that diagnosis. Now that's really hard to get. And we have an organization that does it in our community. Riley does it. Some people have to go to Chicago, but for all of these places, the wait list is really long. And that's a problem, especially when here we're saying to families, hey, early intervention, early diagnosis is so important, and go ahead and wait to be able to get the evaluation. Now, our community has made some steps in this process. I know a lot of organizations now and health professionals are using autism screeners. These screeners are great. and great at being able to help a clinician be able to get an early diagnosis. But ultimately, the gold standard and ultimately what you want to work towards is getting a multidisciplinary evaluations. But there are options to kind of bridge that gap before you're able to get those sorts of evaluations. Now, the other crux in this is that even if you have an autism diagnosis, that doesn't necessarily mean you have the right autism diagnosis. For any care that you're going to receive outside of school, your insurance or Medicaid is going to determine what type of diagnosis you would need to get to be able to access services. So some are going to say that you have to have some sort of multidisciplinary evaluation, where others might just say something simply like, well, your pediatrician has to say it. It's getting harder and harder to get these simple diagnoses. But what counts as a diagnosis is determined oftentimes by your insurance. In addition, even if you have a medical diagnosis of autism, that does not necessarily translate into school services. The school does their own evaluation, and you need to be able to fit the criteria of the school district. So again, this idea of a diagnosis, just because somebody says you have an autism diagnosis, whether or not it's going to be able to get you the services and resources you need are going to depend on what kind of diagnosis you have and what kind of diagnosis you need to be able to access those services. So really important points. I do want to raise one point related to diagnosis for those of you that are seeking diagnosis. Because it's so hard to get diagnoses right now, I know some treatment providers have been starting to do the diagnoses themselves. As for families, I would encourage you to try to get a person independent from a treatment provider to provide you with the diagnosis that you need, because you never know what some of these motivations are in giving you a diagnosis. They might see you as somebody that they want to get into their services, so they might give you a diagnosis that might not be the appropriate diagnosis. Not to say that everybody's doing that, but for the best interest of your kids and for the best interest of your family, I think it's good to get a diagnosis independent from the people who would be providing you the services. It's the same with concerns about allergies. You don't want to go get an allergy diagnosis from somebody who's selling allergy medications. You want to get an allergy diagnosis from somebody who is kind of looking at your whole mental or your whole health. So it's the same thing with autism. I like to keep diagnosis separate from the people who would then be providing that specific treatment to the individuals with autism. Sometimes you don't have that option. It doesn't necessarily mean everybody in that circumstance has that motivation. But as a consumer, I would be wary of those sorts of situations. Now, within autism diagnosis, you'll hear the term ADOS. That ADOS is the gold standard. Well, ADOS is not necessarily the gold standard in and of itself. It's a tool that's used to help with the diagnosis of autism, and it has cutoffs. And if you're above these cutoffs, essentially the person who's doing the diagnosis is using this as a tool to be able to determine whether or not you meet the criteria for autism. So just because you're above the cutoff in an ADOS doesn't in itself mean that you have or you don't have autism. The tool is not created for that. It's not precise enough to say on its own that you do or do not have autism. The state of Michigan for a long time was using the ADOS that way. And even Kathy Ward, the person who created it, was saying, no, this is not the way you're supposed to use the ADOS. Essentially, for a good autism diagnosis, you have some sort of semi-structured play, whether it's the ADOS or another tool. It's often the ADOS. You get information from the parents to see if the things that you're seeing in the clinical environment also apply in the home environment, in the school environment, because kids can act differently in different environments. But ultimately, the actual diagnosis comes down to clinical judgment. So it's that clinician saying that you do or do not meet these specific criteria. Things like the ADOS the ADI, the MCHAT, these are all tools for a clinician to be able to make that diagnosis. But ultimately, it comes down to that clinician's judgment. You heard me say this before, but again, with a multidisciplinary evaluation, you're going to get a speech evaluation, you're going to hopefully get a medical evaluation, an evaluation of kind of your supports in your family and home by a social worker. But ultimately, these diagnoses come down to clinical judgment. It's actually one of the most fun and one of the hardest clinical evaluations that you can do, because essentially you play with a child, an adolescent, or an adult in a way that's appropriate for their age. So it could be getting down on the floor and playing with bubbles. It could be having a conversation about friends and boyfriends and girlfriends if you're doing this with somebody that's older. But essentially it's created to create social situations where somebody can show you their social skills or kind of show how these situations are hard. So you're taking notes while you're trying to be social with somebody. It's really kind of a challenge to do. But again, it's just one piece of a diagnosis. You heard me allude to this, but this is a really important piece. For the longest time, there was a conception that autism was a high SES diagnosis, that it seemed like it was more prevalent in children of professors. And what we found over time was children of professors just had a ton of resources to be able to access diagnoses. It actually, if you look at incidence, it doesn't differ based on socioeconomic status. It also doesn't differ based on race, racial, or ethnic identities or backgrounds. And very similar to what we're seeing in girls, there have been very careful studies that have looked that African American individuals, Hispanic American individuals can often take 2 to 3 more visits, even with the same presenting symptoms, to be able to get a diagnosis. And they're often more likely diagnosed with things like disruptive behavior disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, even with those same presenting symptoms. So it seems like a bias that we have as a diagnostic community that's really important to be aware of. So let's pivot here and talk a little bit about treatment approaches and kind of accessing treatment throughout the lifespan. The very first thing that I'm going to say, even before you get, if you're a little kid, before you get your diagnosis and you're showing developmental delays, Indiana has a tremendous first steps program. St. Joseph County has a very robust first steps program, Elkhart County as well, where you can access speech, OT, PT, developmental therapy, even before you have these specific diagnoses. And this is birth to 3, and for kids who are not meeting their early milestones. So it's an important thing to keep in your toolbox in the back of your mind. And I've given some numbers here. The numbers are really easy to get to. If you just go to First Steps Indiana, you should be able to get who your appropriate providers are. And there are multiple providers of First Steps in every county, so you actually get to choose which provider you have. Availability is often tight, so sometimes your choice is dependent on who has openings at that time. But it's a really important service that we have within our community. Second, for somebody who's just got their diagnosis, I like to connect them with the Autism Speaks First 100 Days Kit. Autism Speaks has some things, taken some controversial stances on things, but there are some things that Autism Speaks does really well. Their First 100 Days Kit for a family who just got a diagnosis, or for an older individual who just got a diagnosis. They have First 100 Days Kit if you're a toddler, they have one if you're school age, and they have one if you're an adult. That helps you understand autism, what sort of terms are going to be thrown at you. And this resource is something that's great to give to families, especially those that are just thirsting for knowledge, and you get it all in one big packet. So it's a nice first step for people who might not know very much about the diagnosis, or might be really interested to learn a lot more about the diagnosis. When you do get the diagnosis, regardless of what age you are, I know we as an organization, I know a lot of organizations try to get the families connected with the Indiana Family Supports waiver. What this does, and we try to do this as quickly as possible because it could take over a year to be able to qualify for this waiver. But what this does is it gives you a small amount of money, but a small amount of money isn't chump change when you can use it flexibly for different types of services. You can't typically use it, but it won't cover a lot of speech. It won't cover a lot of ABA because those typically you need more visits than this alone is going to be able to cover. Use the money up pretty fast. But being able to access transportation, be able to access respite care, if you have an individual who has high needs, all of these sorts of things, getting connected with the waiver is a great tool to have in your toolkit, especially to cover gaps in what you can fund and what you can pay for. So we have a local office that can help you with that. You can also call Logan and we can kind of help you walk you through that process, whether or not you're in autism services, Down syndrome or whatever services, we can kind of help you get connected with the Deeds office and be able to access that treatment. So even before we talk about treatment, we haven't even talked about treatment approaches. These are some things that are available to families that it's really important to connect people to these resources. Now, when we talk about treatment, you've heard me talk about autism in terms of behavior. Poor Leanne, she just left me because she's heard me say this a million times. But when we're talking about treatment of autism, we're not talking about some sort of miracle cure. We've already identified autism as a different way of processing the world that has strengths and areas in need of support. And I think back to my childhood, and there were these shoes called the Reebok pumps, which if you just pump them up, they would make you run faster, they would make you jump higher, and all of these different things. There was a guy, E. Brown, who won the slam dunk contest, and he pumped up his pumps before he went to do it, and he stayed in the NBA for like one more year, and then he was gone. So clearly the pumps didn't help him that much. Ultimately, with autism, you're talking about building skills, social skills, adaptive skills. They're like muscles that you need to work to get better at. So that's why there are really no medications that are cures for autism, because medications don't build social skills. You have to work on these things over time. So you think about, in contrast, somebody like Michael Jordan. So even as he got older, even as he got slower, he worked on his game, he worked on his skills so that he could be better. And that's the same thing we're talking about when we're talking about treatment approach or treatment approaches for individuals with autism. Every time I give a talk, I have somebody who raises their hand and they say, have you heard of so-and-so treatment? There's so many different options out there, the vast majority of which don't have a lot of support. We can talk about different things related to hyperbaric oxygen chambers and diets and all of these different things that have, and there's so many different things that have been, every time that I go on the news, they hear so-and-so is being used to cure autism, dolphin treatment, like all of these different things. But within our community, there are things that we can focus on that we know give real progress and real support for individuals with autism. That being said, there's something to be wary of. There's no single approach that helps all individuals with autism. There's no single approach that helps with all of the characteristics of autism. And there's no medicine that treats autism. We'll talk a little bit about medicine in a second, but there's no specific medicine that treats a core symptom of autism. So currently, the best approach involves multiple approaches tailored to the need of the individual. The most common approach in our area is applied behavior analysis. Tons of research on ABA, and often the diagnosticians, this will be their first report. Oh, you have autism, you need ABA. Now, part of the reason why ABA is so prevalent beyond its empirical support is that it's covered in the autism mandate. So autism mandate, state by state by state, often the first thing that gets included under the mandate is that insurances need to cover ABA, just because it has had the most research done on it. So in Indiana, most insurances and Medicaid now cover ABA. And when I say most insurances, there are loopholes. So if your insurance is from the marketplace, it covers ABA. If your business is a self-funded insurance program, like Logan, like Notre Dame, that insurance is not required to cover ABA. The organization gets to choose whether that's one of the boxes that's checked in their coverage plan. It's a loophole, and it's a pretty common loophole state to state. Whirlpool, for example, in Michigan, was another self-funded plan. And oftentimes, parents will have to go and advocate for their organization to check that box to have something like ABA covered within the mandate. So kind of an interesting quirk about the way these mandates work. It wasn't until recently that Medicaid was required to cover, across the nation was required to cover the service. ABA is pretty individualized. It targets skills development, problematic behavior reduction, social development play. It can be used for really young kids. It can be used for 98-year-old adults, depending on what sort of things you're trying to work out. Now, there's a misconception of what ABA was in the past. A lot of kind of the old ABA was you were trying to teach kids to do things just with food. And in early versions of ABA, there were aversive punishments. Even when I did my first observation when I was in college, if a kid, I was in the Eden Institute in New Jersey, and if a kid would stand up, the kid would get squirted with something to get them to sit back down. It was absolutely horrible. And it took me a while to kind of get over these sorts of things. And so you could, essentially kids were in cubicles, they didn't have interaction with other people. It was really kind of an old way of doing therapy. The good news is that we've really moved past this as a field. And I'm happy to say that a lot of the providers in our community are really kind of working towards what's a new model. You can't do aversives anymore, so don't even worry about that. You can see how things like this would create a perception about ABA that maybe is not applicable to what's actually being done today. So it's still one-on-one, even though you can do groups, you can do social skills and those sorts of things. But the shift has been towards more natural reinforcers as opposed to things like food and aversive behaviors. So things that would naturally reinforce somebody to be able to do certain types of behaviors or to decrease problematic behaviors. A lot of the programs will have open classrooms now instead of being in cubicles, and this allows for more socialization, because ultimately that's what we're talking about, is socialization that we want to increase. Like, for example, Logan today, our Logan Autism Services, we don't have a table here today because our entire staff is doing a field day for our kids, where we're working on skills by having this big kind of celebration of different things that we're able to do. So again, like getting more towards natural, real environments, doing things in the community. We have community-based providers, doing things in the schools. So ABA has really kind of changed in that sort of way, in that sort of focus. But again, if you're looking for ABA services, these are the kind of things that you're really looking for. This one kind of new, more progressive style of ABA. Get tons of, so I'm not a PCBA, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm really kind of a generalist. But I do, by the nature of ABA and its prominence in our community and in our country, I get a lot of questions about ABA. So the question is, does everybody with autism need ABA, and should be the first treatment for everyone? No. You need to think about what that individual's needs are. And not everybody needs 40 hours of intensive work. However, ABA as an approach is really flexible and can work on a lot of different skills. So even though it might not be appropriate for everyone, it's definitely something that's worth considering. And a lot of the ABA providers, if you go to them, they can talk to you about what sort of things that they can work on and what they might specialize in. So another one again is, why is ABA so time intensive? A lot of the individuals who go into the time-intensive work have pretty significant social needs. and developmental needs. But that being said, shaping behavior and getting rid of problematic behaviors often takes really intensive work, and it's more effective if you can do that intensive work early on. It actually reduces the amount of therapy that you need later on in life. So that's one of the main reasons why there's that kind of intense focus with something like ABA. Now, we tend to associate ABA with autism. Now, ABA is actually science. It's not actually a treatment. So ABA therapy is a treatment, but ABA is a science that can apply to businesses. It can apply to lots of different things within our lives. And it's just prominent in its success and its use for individuals with autism. We're trying to advocate because there's a lot of individuals with other developmental disabilities and significant behavioral needs that probably also need this type of treatment, but can't access it because they don't meet what we think of as autism. So that's an interesting problem. Is ABA only for younger children? You already heard me say that that's not the case. There's not as much research on adolescents and adults. That's why it's harder to get it funded. But it's definitely there's skills that you can build throughout the lifespan. We're actually there's a lawsuit in Indiana right now, and there's some test cases going through right now to get ABA covered in adulthood. And our organization, one of our advocacy organizations, AP, has been on the front line of getting ABA coverage for adults. Is it worth the cost? If you do cost analysis over time, the money spent, especially early on, saves money over time for the state, for insurance companies, and so forth. So ultimately, a lot of the economic analyses show that it's important. And so who should be referred for ABA? Again, this is a really individualized decision, so you need to focus on the skills that individual needs to work on, whether it's something like ABA would specialize in. Now, is it the only approach? Absolutely not. There's actually a diversity of services that are available to individuals in our community. There's actually kind of a different line of approach called developmental approaches that are actually mandated in some states, but they're just not mandated in the state of Indiana. They're actually not mandated in Michigan too. So there are empirically supported approaches like the Early Start Denver model is a really good example of something that has a lot of research support behind it. But again, it hasn't really caught on because the mandates don't necessarily include these types of parent-mediated approaches in their background. We do, within our community, there is some developmental approaches that the Play Project is offered in our community for people. There's some people who just don't want to do it. It's just not kind of their thing. And ultimately, we can advocate for something being important for somebody, but it's the family's children and ultimately they get to make the treatment choices. So there are developmental options that are available in our community. Oftentimes the families are going to have to pay out of pocket. There are exceptions where you can kind of work around it, but they can be an alternative for people who don't want to go to the legal route. We have tons of opportunity within our community for speech, occupational therapy, social skills groups. If you have there are parent support groups in the community. If you have the waiver, you can access recreation and community rehabilitation and different kinds of support. So a lot of these programs are offered in our community. I wanted to highlight a couple that I'm really excited about. And I'm a little biased because I'm involved with the Masters of Autism Studies program, so full disclosure, that's my bias here. But we have a huge lack of opportunities for social skills for people who don't need intensive ABA, for people who don't necessarily need to be pulled away from their peers to be able to get support. So Michael Waddell and the Masters of Autism Studies program has really been working to get social skills training programs to train people in our community to use the peers model, which is the first and the best empirically supported manualized social skills model that's available. So it works on different ages. There's one that we offer at Logan for adults. I know other community providers are also using aspects of peers in what they do, but this works on real life scenarios like bullying. and helps build social skills that you can then apply, in real life. There's an adolescent summer skills program that I think is just about tying up right now, but it's going to become a staple of one of the things that's evolved to us or available to us in the community. But something to kind of keep in mind, because it's one of the really cool things that our community is starting to develop over time. Medications, there are actually 2 FDA-approved medications for the treatment of autism, which might seem different from what I just said earlier, but let me explain. Risperdal and Abilify are approved to treat aggression and irritability in autism, not social communication, not repetitive behavior, so not core diagnostic criteria of autism. What these medications are useful for is kind of taking off the edge for somebody who's really struggling, so that you can put skill building plans in place for them, behavioral plans in place for them, so they can build those skills. They can't be used alone. They've got to be combined with some sort of therapeutic support plan for individuals with autism. A lot of the other medications that are used off-label, and that's a decision between a psychiatrist or a doctor and their family to be able to try things, to be able to help out things. But part of the reason why there isn't a lot of things that are approved for individuals with autism is really hard to get things research paid for on children with medications. So there's just a lot of what we do with medications. We try them out on adults and we say, oh, they're probably going to work the same on kids, which is not always the case. These kids' brains are a lot different than our brains. But that's what we have with medications, and everything else other than these 2 is some sort of off-label use of the medications. There have been a number of studies on melatonin and how it helps with some problems in individuals with autism. So if you have somebody who's really struggling with sleep, definitely something to bring up and have them talk to their doctor or their psychiatrist about something like melatonin being able to help regulate sleep. I already mentioned that there are a bunch of complementary and alternative approaches that are out there. It's not necessarily something that I advocate for. I obviously work with families, trying to work with families that are making these personal choices with their own money. But oftentimes some of the alternative therapies like equine therapy or music therapy, things like that, sometimes those are a little bit different in my mind, because even though riding a horse isn't necessarily going to cure autism, if you pair a preferred activity with some sort of skill building, like if you have a professional that can work on communication skills, a professional that can work on appropriate behaviors while the person is participating in a preferred activity, like music, or like if they like horseback riding, those are things that if you make things fun, you're actually going to be more likely to get social engagement. So I really do encourage creativity in environments and in programming, really building off what people find as fun, as long as it's paired with some sort of skill building. It's the same thing with iPad apps. You'll see all these news reports about iPad apps that help treat autism. An iPad app in itself or something like that, putting somebody in front of a screen is not going to make them more social. However, if you can somehow incorporate that into some sort of social activity, you can have them doing something fun as long as there's something social incorporated. So again, just be wary of people who are saying that apps are going to help. There really has to be some sort of social or skill building component to that. Anybody who's looking at treatment, the #1 predictor in treatment outcomes consistently is parent involvement. It helps empowers the family. It helps the kid or the adolescent or adult at home. It also increases the well-being of the family. So involving them in the treatment, helping them and empowering them is a really important approach. And if you're working with providers, really encourage that as a part of the treatment. And also don't forget about SIBS. That's me and my brother way back in the day. I always like to say, and I give specific talks on SIBs if you ever want to have me come and talk about it. It's one of my favorite talks. One of the great things about SIBs and involving them in progress and in therapy is that we as parents have a tendency to protect our children. And that can be really good. And so it's like a very natural thing for us to do as parents. The beautiful thing about SIBs is they're more inclined to say, you can do that yourself. And for people that are trying to develop independence, independent skills, somebody who's willing to hold them accountable in that sort of way is pretty good. And for some individuals with developmental disabilities and autism, it might be the vast majority of their social interaction. The person who's willing to interact with them the most is their sibling. So the more that you can empower the siblings, it's really helpful. Now, everything that I've been talking about has been specific. School is a whole different conversation. Whether you're talking about elementary, middle, and high school, or whether you're talking about college, you know, just within this conversation right here, a great resource for families to have if they have questions about navigating IEPs and things within school. We're blessed to have InSource here, and they are a tremendous resource for families. The schools themselves will also have resources, and that's really individual based on the school district. And we have some great special educators in our community. But InSource is a great thing to connect families with as they're trying to navigate the school system, just understanding, you know, what sort of things they should be looking for, and what sort of questions that they should be asking. There's a new thing this year. If you have children that are going to private schools in Indiana, you actually have flexibility with your school choice dollars, where you can divert some of those dollars towards therapy, towards speech, occupational therapy, ABA, physical therapy. You actually have flexibility in how you can use this money. It's called the Indiana Education Scholarship Account Program. So if you have families that are in private schools, definitely encourage them to look at this, because this might allow them to access services that might typically be provided in a public education system that are maybe not available in a private education system, that can lead for them, if they have a desire for a private education, to have a more inclusive environment within that private education. So it's an interesting thing. We're just learning about it. It's just launching this fall, but it's a really interesting resource that's available. I'm going to highlight what I think now is one of the big donut holes, which is autism in adolescence and adulthood. More and more research is showing that individuals with autism tend to struggle, particularly with adaptive functioning. That's things like self-care, navigating the community, you know, kind of planning and self-regulation, a lot of those kind of executive functioning skills as they get into adolescence and adulthood. And if you think about the way our lives change, when we're little, our lives are really structured for us. You get to middle school, they're less structured. High school, they're even less structured. And holy cow, you go off of a cliff once you get into college or you get into adulthood. And this in particular is an area that seems to be an area of struggle for individuals with autism. So in terms of, in addition to that, we typically have fewer and fewer services available to kids as they age. And when they get into adulthood, a lot of individuals with autism aren't eligible for the services that are available to people with other developmental disabilities. And they get caught in this donut hole of services where they might need vocational support. They might need support at college if they're able to go to college. They might need more independent living skills. And all of a sudden, a lot of these supports are not available to them at the level that they need. So within our community and nationwide, this is a major crisis that we're running into. We've invested all this time over the past 2 decades in training and creating skills for people to be successful. And all of a sudden, as they transition into adulthood, the support services are not prepared for them. They're not specialized to be able to help them. Colleges are not necessarily equipped to have a whole bunch of new kids with or adults with autism who are going to college and are succeeding, but when they get to school, they're having trouble getting to class, following the syllabus, or knowing how to manage their time. So these are big things. And this is a crisis. We know that over 50% of adults with autism are living at home and are not employed or never employed. And many of them are also underemployed. And we know that things like employment, going to college, those sorts of things have a pretty strong effect on life satisfaction for anybody, but for people with autism as well. So bridging this gap right now is a huge issue. In college, we know that only about a third of individuals with autism who started finish it. And it seems like a lot of these individuals are definitely ready in terms of intelligence, but adaptive skills are not there. I'm sure some of the other providers get these calls as well, but I get tons of calls of kids who are adults, they go to college, they go for their first semester, and they're 3/4 of the way through the semester, and they're so far behind that all of the balls just kind of drop, and they flunk out of college and they have to come back. It's just such a common call that I get right now. And a lot of it is not the academics. A lot of it are those life skills, those daily living skills, being able to navigate what's a very challenging environment. I remember I was a mess my first semester at college. At one point, I stayed home for fall break, and I was so excited because instead of going to the dorm, I was going to go buy me a thing of raviolis. I bought me a thing of raviolis. I got all the way home, and I realized that it was something that I had to have a can opener, and I didn't have a can opener, so I had to figure out how to break the thing open to be able to get it. So you see the challenge. It's hard. It's hard if you haven't been able to do these sorts of skills, and especially hard for individuals with autism. So this is a major moral imperative for us in our community, and I don't have a lot of great answers right now. I know as part of our 75th anniversary, we're going to be working towards putting in life skills positions to be able to help with this transition. But as a community, we all need to work together to support these individuals. There are options that weren't available before within the schools. If you have a 504 plan, you can qualify for pre-eds, kind of educational and vocational training and opportunities. We do have vocational rehabilitation that's available as you transition into adulthood, but a number of our individuals with autism either aren't eligible or don't think that they would be eligible or don't necessarily think that they need that avenue for support. So it's about both opening up vocational rehabilitation, but creating additional training opportunities outside of what the state system is. We're working right now at building adult social skills and life skills programs. There's a couple of life skills trainers that are available in the community that we can connect you with if you're looking for that. But again, it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg of what people need within our community. Another thing that we're seeing as individuals with autism are getting into adolescence and into adulthood, there are feelings of isolation. We can get back to that idea of social motivation. A lot of individuals who might desire social interaction but are really struggling and feeling disconnected. And we know that a lot of individuals are vulnerable to depression and anxiety and adolescence. And in adolescence, things like depression are harder to diagnose than autism. Individuals with autism tend to be pretty subtle in their mannerisms and facial expressions as it is. So being able to look for physical and emotional cues for depression are a lot harder. The other thing that's tricky is that even if we do identify these things in individuals, we have a lot of fantastic mental health providers in our community, but not enough who have experience and are trained to work with individuals with autism or have a desire to help individuals with autism as part of their specialty. So it's something that we as a nation and as a community need to work towards in terms of recruiting people and hopefully working with people to build the expertise to work with individuals with autism, adolescents, and adulthood who are suffering mental health issues. They're all things that are really, really important. So kind of to sum all of this up, we really have a bunch of imperatives, moral imperatives as a community. You heard me talking about spreading knowledge about what autism and what autism is and what autism isn't. Treatment availability. We've done a great job with ABA. We have a lot of options now with ABA. We have to think broadly across the lifespan about what individual specific needs are. How can we fill these other gaps, specifically with adolescents and adults? Those are major issues right now. We need to think about autism-specific vocational supports outside of what's available through the state. And we need to educate and be aware of the gender and racial disparities that we're definitely seeing that are real. And finally, getting at this idea of mental health awareness and support beyond autism. There's autism, and there are things that are happening downstream that autism is affecting in the individual. So definitely something that we need to improve on as a community. The good news is, and Hans Asperger once said that predisposition is not a fate, but rather a possible fate. All of these things are that we can work on and help and improve as a community. So we collectively, as a community, need to work on it. For example, I'm really proud to say, I've been involved with St. Mary's Master of Autism Studies program. We've been working on building those supports within the Autism Studies program here. Derek at IUSB has been really working hard the past couple of years at improving what we have within IUSB's supports that they have there. And it's something across our community, whatever our expertise on, we have to kind of think about it. It's a hard thing, but we have to figure out how we can increase these sorts of supports in our community. So wanted to end by thanking all of the individuals with autism and their families who inspire me every single day. All the amazing things that they do and learn and advocate for. If you ever want to contact me, probably the easiest way not to forget is autism@logancenter.org. Those all go directly to me, and I kind of divert them. Email is always the best way to get hold of me. Typically, when people contact me, it's about the hard issues. I get a couple of calls each day just about challenging circumstances for which there aren't an easy answer. Sometimes it's providers, sometimes it's other professionals, sometimes it's families. But that's part of the reason why I'm here, just to kind of talk through things. And I don't always have an answer, but I can do my best to try to help and support you. And again, if you ever want me to come and talk with, if you have a staff or things that you want me to consult with, again, I'm at Logan. So everything that I do is a gift to the community, considering all that the community gives to us. So it's a ton of information, and I apologize. Any one of those things we could go a lot more into. But maybe this is a time if anybody has any questions about specific things. Yeah.
So there's a one of our virtual attendees is asking, is MChat a sensitive screener for girls?
So a fantastic question. It's a great question. And I would say it's sensitive, but the question is, it's sensitive enough? So the ADOS is sensitive for girls, but it's not sensitive enough. I think we're talking about a matter of degree with both of those diagnostic tools. And the problem is there's not like a quick fix. It's not like they can go and put a couple of new questions in there and it's going to make it better. Right now, we're still at the point where we're trying to get that female phenotype understood better to be able to better measure these things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of just a pondering, but autism has a spectrum attached to it. But why doesn't depression? Why doesn't ADHD? Why don't they have spectrums? Is that something we could answer?
So the more recent, so each one of those gets a little bit farther afield from me. So with ADHD, one of the more recent research does see ADHD as more of a spectrum, just because people vary in terms of their attention capabilities. Even individuals with autism who are diagnosed in addition with ADHD, their attention difficulties are very different than what we see as traditional ADHD. So for example, traditional ADHD is kind of slippery attention. You kind of go from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. And you have trouble focusing. individuals with autism, what we're seeing with their attention is they get so hyper-focused on something that they aren't paying attention to what's going on over here. So it looks like attention issues that you're not paying attention, but the root of it is very different. So what we're seeing is ADHD is defined based on these attention issues, these hyperactivity issues, but the root cause and the pathway to it can be very, very depression, again, I don't want to overstep my bounds because I think probably people here who know a lot more about depression than I do. You know, from what I know about depressive disorders, even if you think about you have diagnostic categories that can range from depressive to manic to bipolar to, even if you think about that conceptually, that still is kind of a depressive spectrum. And oftentimes meeting the criteria versus not meeting the criteria is determined by the amount of struggle that it causes that individual and how it affects their well-being. So I do think with other conditions within the mental health realm, you do see that spectrum. Even something you think is cut and dry as schizophrenia, we're learning a ton more about schizophrenia in terms of the variability of the diagnosis. Yeah.
So I do diagnostic intakes for OFON,
Yeah.
and we can't treat autism at OFON. And a lot of times with the child and adolescent assessments I do, I am not sure because we see a lot of like oppositional defiant behavior, but then also some autism features. So I'm not sure like what are some of the key things I can look for if I need to like make a referral out.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be slapping a kid with an ODD diagnosis when it's autism.
Right. And so ultimately what you're looking at is the root of that behavior. You know, with something like autism, how much is the root of those behaviors related to social communication? How ultimately that's what you're trying to get at in your role. I imagine that there are times that you don't have access to all the information you need to be able to make those decisions. Those are the circumstances in which that individual probably needs like a multidisciplinary evaluation. There's some kids that definitely have autism. There's some kids that definitely don't have autism. But there are a lot of kids that have behavioral issues that could manifest from autism and might not. And those are the complex cases where I think you need kind of a multidisciplinary team to be able to look at all facets for that individual. But that being said, ultimately what you're looking at in your role is social communication and interaction. Are there repetitive behaviors that seem to be the root of what these other behaviors are seeing?
There's another virtual question. Actually, two virtual questions. What do you tell adult clients who are seeking autism diagnosis? What advice do you have for referrals who could complete testing in the area? So testing, diagnosis for adults.
So there aren't a lot, and it's actually a question that we get a ton. Typically, and it varies depending on whether that individual lives in South Bend or they live in Niles or St. Joe or Elkhart. A lot of it is a providers. There's not really a lot of people who specialize in autism diagnoses as adults. So a lot of it is the willingness of providers to be able to give those sorts of evaluations and diagnoses. So I don't have a great answer for that. It's something that's tough right now. And you might think that it's infrequent that a 35-year-old might come to you and they're concerned about autism, but if you think about like that age range, those are the individuals that would meet criteria for autism right now, but 25 years ago they probably didn't meet that criteria, or they were in they were under the care of somebody that maybe didn't recognize what needed autism support. So it's actually a really common issue right now. So I don't know if I have a good answer in terms of getting a diagnosis. I will say that unfortunately there aren't a lot of treatments for adults right now. you don't necessarily need an autism diagnosis to be able to access services as an adult right now. So even though that diagnosis might be good to understand their own kind of identity in terms of what's available now, life skills support, social skills support, those sorts of things, those don't require an autism diagnosis per se.
Thank you.
I wish I had a better answer. It's a huge issue.
You mentioned earlier that some people have like autism, those type of characteristics of autism without actually having autism. I just wanted to go into that.
Actually, Molly Losh at the University of Northwestern does great work on this. So if you're ever interested in kind of quenching that thirst, looking up some of her research, she does fantastic. Molly Losh, L-O-S-H. I'm kind of trying to get Michael Waddell to get her to come and speak. She's really interesting. She's really engaging. What we see are things like what would be called in autism is what kind of called insistence on sameness. The idea that your environment has to be a certain way and you get upset if you're getting off of your schedule. Another example is the ability to hyper focus on things. That would be an example of a skill where if you're able to block everything out and learn everything you can about a specific topic, you can see how that would be a big skill. If you were a meteorologist or you were a professor or if you were an engineer, like you could see how that hyper focus without the social difficulties could be something that would be a strength. We do see pragmatic social difficulties that do seem to kind of clump with that, and that makes sense that social difficulties where you're not really good at social interaction, but you don't have so much struggle that you can't kind of get along in life is kind of another one of the things that we typically see as part of what we think of as the broader autism phenotype. But when we talk about things that lead to a diagnosis of autism, that's when a lot of these things start to make a little bit more sense. The vast majority of individuals with autism have some sort of multi-genetic, complex genetic heritage. But a small percentage of individuals have some sort of single gene difference. But it does seem like there are a lot of characteristics within the community that kind of when they come together in a certain combination lead to the strengths, but also the struggles that we see in autism. So, but those are some of the things that we see. Anxiety actually is another one that we think of as part of the broader autism phenotype, and specific types of anxiety around social interaction. Yeah.
You talked about the importance of early intervention. So I know you said that multidisciplinary screening can be hard to get with the very long. Is it possible to get like just a screen specifically for autism early?
And that's what our community has started to do a little bit more. And I think that that's great. But the catch-22 with that is that to get that, you have to get the kind of evaluation that's going to count for your insurance company to be able to cover that support. So that's the trick. And that's an advocacy thing too. That's not just us providing that in our community, but advocating for more things to count. Yeah.
Yeah, I went through some training a number of years ago where they were talking about how you communicate with someone who is on the autism spectrum and the communication deficit. They really emphasize using kind of visual communication tools as opposed to auditory. Is that still kind of current?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's going to obviously depend on their language level, especially with lower levels of language. The visual supports become a lot more important. With verbal adults, I think visuals do help as part of a presentation, but I would also emphasize within the verbal communication, focusing on concrete language as opposed to metaphors and idioms and those sorts of language. Because we use them so commonly that we don't even realize when we're using them. But those sort of metaphorical language are things that even within verbal communication. I love this. This is great. Great questions. Yeah.
One specific issue I see with kids sometimes in adolescence, and maybe you can remember this with your brother too, or kids you work with, is an issue with like what's perceived as and is sometimes this kind of like the autistic individual arguing back with teachers and parents, and that kind of that narrow focus, like getting stuck on a point, so that's like a social disruption. What kind of interventions do they do in ABA, or what do you suggest for some of that?
So it's great. And so there's two different things there. Sometimes it's getting stuck on a point, and sometimes it's being so blunt and literal that it seems like it's confrontation. Like it's kind of saying it the way it is. Like if I forgot to shave one day, I would have one of the kids tell me about how ugly I look. like it's that sort of bluntness sometimes, and sometimes it's just not being able to get off of the point. And for that individual, that can serve different purposes, right? Maybe it's not necessarily that they don't understand what you're saying, but maybe they're not getting the answer that they want. So they might stick on that, stick on that, stick on that. It's a couple of different things. In terms of therapeutic support, one of the things that's helped with that has been video modeling. I don't know how familiar people are with video modeling, but those things like that can be really tough because they're very subtle, and it's hard to tell unless you see yourself kind of back out in that sort of circumstance. So there are types of video modeling in which you set up a scene that the kid watches, and then they can see how somebody's doing that. But even better is if you videotape a session and the kid is engaging in that behavior, and then they're able to see that behavior, that can also help them in terms of being able to understand that perspective. The hard thing is though, is these aren't simple skills. These are really subtle skills, social skills that are something that most of us kind of get naturally, but definitely, being able to kind of step back and see that perspective can definitely help. You can set up simple rules about, things like how many questions you're supposed to ask or how many times you can ask the same question. And those are helpful to an extent if you kind of just learn a couple of rules. But being able to understand how that's perceived is kind of helpful. That's where something like video modeling comes in. Scott Bellini, I use a lot of time. Go ahead.
It's probably obvious everyone here have to be, I'm just a parent, I'm not, I'm a background. My 8-year-old daughter is exhibiting symptoms of something that could be autism or ADHD. With school, and her pediatrician wasn't exactly concerned. I don't know where to go to find a diagnosis for her. Do you have any advice for parents that need school social worker necessarily, or I don't know where to go?
So if we have a bunch of providers in here. So normally I'd say, well, give us a call at Logan. We're happy to help you, put you in that opportunity. But a lot of the autism providers within the community, including Logan and My House and Journeys, and a lot of the people that are here today, can help you get connected with somebody who can provide a diagnosis. And there are a number of people who can help autism specific diagnosis.
What are the recommendations? Sorry, do I need to take her to someone like specifically for autism, or for ADHD, or is it just kind of going to the same diagnosis?
Somebody who is trained in doing autism diagnosis would often be also trained in being able to do a diagnosis. I'd be happy to talk with you offline about some of the things that are.
Josh, can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Real quick? One thing just wanted to add to what Josh was saying about assessments is if you do have concerns that your child, you're not sure what your kid has, right? That's the reason we go. If you have concerns that there may be more than one diagnosis, make sure you find a provider who does assessments that do kind of this shotgun approach, right? Because what I do assessments and what I say to parents is, hey, if I come back and I say your kid doesn't have autism, don't you still want to know what they do have that's causing the problem,
Right.
So make sure you find a provider that's not just gonna look at autism, they're gonna look at what else could it be if that doesn't explain it. So just to kind of add to that.
And that's a good diagnosis, is not going in there with, I'm just gonna look and see if it's one thing or not. It's kind of looking like that. You have one, I'm on.
Yeah, well, there is one online, but actually this is my question.
Oh.
So, it's really striking that, as kids become adults and either do or don't succeed with getting a college degree, the employment piece seems to be a really significant piece of, what does the community need to do to provide support? What do employers need to do, so that these, adults can have, lives that are including employment and, all of the things that we all take for granted, basically.
And there's so many different levels to it too. So there's knowing how to look for a job
Mhm.
and knowing the skills that you need to be able to do the job that you want, at a very basic level. Once you identify that and see that it's available, being able to interview for that job and having the skills to be able to interview for that job. Even with lots of training and lots of skill, individuals with autism can come off as different or awkward. So, working with businesses about what autism is, so that you can recognize the skills, even if that individual might bring, even if interviewing is not their strength. We make so many decisions. I make so many decisions. Everybody here makes decisions based off of interviews, and interviews are making a social impression. That's a training aspect and an awareness aspect. And then when you get into the position, being able to be collegiate and do your job, being able to not allow things that are hard for you to get in the way of your ability to do the job, to find a job that kind of accentuates your strengths and doesn't put too much pressure on areas that are hard for you. It's a complex thing. And again, I don't want to criticize any community, because I think that this is the result of success. Like, I think we have a lot of kids who are now adolescents and adults who now have these opportunities that maybe they wouldn't have had before, but we're not ready as a community to provide that next level of support.
So I'm aware of Greenbridge Growers as an organization that was founded specifically.
Yes.
I don't know if everybody knows about that as an organization, but it's one organization. It's a relatively small operation. So who else is doing, this sort of coaching and interacting with businesses?
So Greenbridge Growers, for those of you who are not familiar, they do aquaponics in terms of raising food and providing locally grown sustainable food. And they offer employment training to individuals with autism and some other developmental disabilities. They started at Hannah and Friends. They won a bunch of awards. They do amazing things, and there's not a lot of organizations that are like that in any community. Unfortunately, right now, a lot of that support would have to come through voc rehab to be able to get a job coach. We have a couple of people who provide life skills training and support through the waiver for adults. But oftentimes that's once a week. And in my opinion, a lot of the individuals that are coming to me asking questions need more than that. They need more hands-on job coaching at first, and then you kind of pull those supports back. And those are the things that aren't necessarily there. Yeah.
Can I throw out a resource as well?
Yeah.
Clubhouse is like their provides sort of life skills training, for things that will help in jobs and life. Be a really good resource.
And the funding for that, where does the funding, is that waiver funded or is that private paid or
I
insurance?
know they do a lot of fundraising, I cannot remember if it's, that would be something they do. But
And it's mental illness and also,
I know it's primarily mental illness, but I know people with autism who have and done the same services.
interesting. So Clubhouse of St. Joe County,
For the farmers market.
interesting. Good resource, thank you.
Non-interact with autism folks.
I don't have a lot of.
Not super active in our community, unfortunately, right now. They had been historically. Yeah, in the past, though, most of their activity has been in like the Notre Dame community and helping students and parents of people with mental illness. And they had a very active parent support group there 10 years ago. But they're really quiet right now in the community, unfortunately.
I saw a statistic and it was, staggering. It was like 10 to 15% of college graduates are employed with their college degree. So we have at IUSB career services office, and so they do some of that skill building. They do kind of job interview, kind of role playing that helps students build their LinkedIn page, things like that. So I'd encourage you, if you have a child who is at a university, to kind of seek an office like that might be able to support them. So I also do placements for internships and things like that, so they can get that professional development.
And if you have families that are looking to navigate college and they're trying to decide between different colleges and trying to understand what questions to ask about autism support, I get calls like that all the time, and I'm happy to sit down with an individual and their parents and just talk with them. It's like it's a no charge thing, just a phone call or a Zoom or whatever, just to kind of talk about what sort of questions they might have about that. Happy to talk to people about those sorts of things. Whether it's locally or whether it's, they want to go to Valpo or UC Davis or wherever they want to go.
There was just one other virtual question, which was from Tom. Have you seen examples of autism diagnosis actually being lack of parental skills or involvement?
As that being the root of autism? So this is another presentation. Actually, in my St. Mary's class, I do a whole class on the history of parent and parental involvement. So it's a tricky thing to talk about because originally it was thought to be caused by parents and specifically non-caring mothers. As such, there were all these treatments that were really inhumane treatments where families were being taken, or kids were being taken away from their families because they didn't think that the families were providing adequate love. There was even an Elvis movie, Change of Habit, where Elvis was this miracle worker doctor who hugged the autism out of a girl. Like, I'm not joking. It was horrible, horrible stuff. And so it took a while once we realized that, and I don't want to associate myself with that, even when I say we, that's kind of collectively, I never ever thought that. But we as a society realized that this was not the case, that autism is a complex biological and behavioral condition, that parents weren't causing their autism in the way that they were talking about, that it was really hard to do research for a long time about parents and how they can support individuals with autism. So there was such a reaction to funding that kind of research. There's a really tricky history around that. That being said, we know that parent involvement, parenting in itself doesn't cause autism, but empowering parents can really help individuals with autism. And parenting somebody with autism is different. Parenting every child is different, but specifically individuals with autism, they respond differently than your other children might respond. So you might be the greatest parent in the world and just really struggling with your child. So the parent isn't causing the autism, but we can empower the parents to be able to help the individuals with autism. So it's a long history with that.
Is there any kind of a hereditary aspect to autism?
And I haven't looked at this recently, but the last time that I looked at this, of all of the conditions in the DSM, had one of the highest, if not the highest level of heritability. So if you look at twins studies, and those sorts, it has a high genetic component. But the tricky thing is within autism is that there's not like one pathway. So there's like this pathway of multi-genetic inheritance. There are some individuals that have a single gene difference where autism is not present at all in the rest of the family. Like for example, a 22q deletion is an example. Fragile X is another example where there's a specific genetic difference that can link to a single gene. And then there are others that can't be linked to a gene. Exposure to alcohol in pregnancy, for example, can lead to an autism diagnosis, depending on timing and so forth. Exposure to valproic acid, anti-seizure medication, is another environmental cause of autism, where if you're exposed to BPA during the first trimester of pregnancy, it increases the likelihood. It doesn't 100% lead to autism, but increases the likelihood that you would be diagnosed with autism. So all these things that we're talking about are complex and probably have a genetic component and some sort of environmental component as well. Yeah.
I know a lot of people say that there's like no chance that it's hereditary, like you'll hear that from a lot of people. But when we went to Dr. Graver and I know some was diagnosed, they said that there was like an 86% chance that every subsequent child, if they were full-blooded siblings, as well. And I have Irish twin people for autism, even though there was nothing on the genetic testing that was like Fragile X or anything that was stood out.
And it's tricky too, because we're not talking about 10 genes. Ultimately, again, we go back to TV. You see on TV all the time, the autism gene has been found. The autism, well, there's not an autism gene, which it's complex. I want to focus on a point that you said. Anytime that anybody says any, every, or all related to autism, it's not. There are always exceptions, and we're talking about percentages and likelihood, not necessarily all or none. Fragile X syndrome has one of the highest connections to autism, and we're talking about 25 to 50% of people with Fragile X get diagnosed with autism, and that's one of the highest.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more complex. That being said, there does seem to be a pretty significant genetic contribution for many individuals, not all individuals.
Yeah, she had told me that the genetic counselor said, like, because of my age and my husband's genes, how they mix, because I have a child sort of from previous relationship who's neurodivergent. She said that they could just be the way that you guys gene mix like 1,000 little different things, plus environmental things, and their brains or their bodies can't handle the exposure to certain things or how things fit, and it just so happens that it ends up being.
Yeah.
But at first, people kept saying it's not hereditary, but Dr. Graver showed if you look at statistics, you can see that it can be hereditary. But there's hereditary components that just make it like that.
I'm going to use what you just said to kind of get up on the soapbox for a second. So is it okay if I get up on a real quick soapbox? A lot of times we use terms like risk when we're talking about autism, we're talking about genetics. And I don't think that term applies to autism in the way that it's used. I like to use the term increases the likelihood or decreases the likelihood that somebody's going to be diagnosed with autism. Because you've already heard me say that I think of autism as a different way of processing the world that can lead to strengths and in some cases pretty significant disability. But you know, a combination of genes shouldn't have a balance of being, you know, risky or not risky or those sorts. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about kind of a different processing style that leads to areas of struggle that we need to support. So when we're talking about things like heritability and genetic contribution, these are things that exist in our world that for some people in certain combinations maybe makes it harder for them to navigate the world. I love when Temple Grandin says that she feels like an anthropologist on Mars. Like she has all these strengths and things, but she has trouble understanding what the heck other people are doing and why they're acting that way. And I think that she's a good model in that sense to think about things like genes. Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask if you were gonna do sibling talks and
I did one for my class last Tuesday. No, I don't have any on the schedule right now, but it's next to presenting to first responders. It's probably the second most common presentation that I do. I'd be happy to do that. I love to. But thank you, everybody. And I want to thank all of our providers and resource people who are here today for coming and helping and supporting the community. I know a lot of you, and I love you, and we're so blessed to have you as part of our community. And let's all work together to be able to make this better.
Well, thank you, Josh. We really appreciate having Dr. Diehl here with us. I wanted just to remind you again, don't forget to fill out your post-test, and also there's the evaluation too. We will make this video of the presentation available on our YouTube website. Give us a couple days to do some editing. But Lisa will send the link to that when she sends you an email for a follow-up with this, with the evaluation for this session.
And the PowerPoint.
And the PowerPoint, yes, of his slides. And then just don't forget, if you want to spend a little bit of time going back and meeting some of the providers and the services in the area,